John D. Rockefeller Sr. kept a revolver by his bed. Not because he was paranoid, because he'd received letters describing homemade bombs addressed to his house. He averaged 50 to 60,000 pieces of mail a month from strangers begging for money. Crowds stood outside the Standard Oil offices just to watch him emerge. By the early 1880s, he was the most hated employer in America, and his children absorbed every ounce of that hatred without ever doing a thing to earn it. He had 5 children, 1 son, 4 daughters, and from the beginning, the architecture of his fortune made clear which of those children would matter to history, and which would carry the weight in silence. This is the story of 3 of those daughters, Elizabeth, known as Bessie, Alta, and Edith. Between them, they received millions of dollars, married into some of America's most powerful families, and hosted the most glittering events of the Gilded Age. And between them, they couldn't trust a single person in their lives who wasn't blood. Because when your last name is Rockefeller, everyone wants something from you. That makes trust not just difficult, it makes it structurally impossible. The fortune didn't free them. It built the cage. Bessie was born in 1866, the eldest, educated at Vassar College, unusual for a woman of her era and social class. She married philosopher Charles Augustus Strong in March 1889. Their families had been connected before the engagement. Strong's father was one of JDR Sr.'s oldest friends, and Charles had been engaged to Bessie since the summer of 1885. She was brilliant, gentle, and, by the time she walked down the aisle, already showing signs of mental instability that would define her adult life. Alta arrived in 1871, steady, focused on charitable work rather than spectacle, with a hands-on commitment to helping immigrant communities through a settlement house she founded called Alta House in Cleveland's Little Italy. She married Chicago attorney Ezra Parmalee Prentice in January 1901, moved to a 1,000-acre estate called Mount Hope in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and proceeded to live as privately as a Rockefeller possibly could. Edith came last, born in 1872. She was the one who burned brightest and broke hardest. At 23, she married Harold McCormick, heir to the Reaper fortune, and moved to Chicago, where she became the most extravagant, controversial, and ultimately tragic figure in the family. Her biographer, Andrea Frederici Ross, called her John D. Rockefeller's most intelligent, creative, and misunderstood child. That last word is the one that matters, misunderstood, even by the people closest to her. To understand what the Rockefeller name cost these women, you have to understand what it cost to simply be a Rockefeller child. By the 1890s, their father controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. He was also, by public consensus, a robber baron who had crushed competitors and accumulated wealth on a scale Americans had never seen. In 1902, journalist Ida Tarbell began her 19-part exposé in McClure's magazine, and whatever remained of Rockefeller's public image was systematically dismantled in print. The girls grew up watching their father become a symbol of everything ordinary Americans despised. The household, despite all of this, ran on enforced frugality. JDR Sr. drilled his children on financial discipline, ledger books, earned allowances, meticulous accounting. Even as Standard Oil was generating wealth that would make him history's first billionaire by 1916. His children grew up on Cleveland's wealthiest street without knowing, for years, that they were the wealthiest family on it. They kept to themselves. That wasn't shyness. That was strategy. The threats were real. Kidnap warnings, bomb letters. The family lived, in the words of those close to them, under siege. The daughters couldn't make friends without wondering what those friends, or their parents, actually wanted. Every relationship existed in the shadow of a question JDR Sr. had spent his life trying to navigate. Are you here for me, or for what I represent? It's a corrosive question to grow up with. None of the sisters ever fully stopped asking it. The fortune's structure made everything worse. JDR Sr. had one child he was training for succession, his son, John Jr. The letters from the family archive are staggering in their explicitness. Dear son, I am giving you $65 million of United States government bonds. Dear son, I am giving you 20,000 shares of the stock of the Standard Oil Company. One gift after another, each addressed to the boy. By the early 1920s, JDR Sr. had transferred over $500 million in assets and securities to his son. John Jr.'s estimated net worth reached $995 million by 1928. The daughters were deliberately excluded from financial education. As Ross documents, the girls had access to the best educators in the world, but learning to steward the family's wealth was reserved for their younger brother. Alta received a trust in 1917, 12,000 shares of Standard Oil of Indiana, worth approximately $9 million. Over her entire lifetime, Edith received more than $14 million from her father. Compared to the world John Jr. controlled, those figures aren't wealth. They're an allowance. Edith understood this. In September 1915, she wrote to her father, John is privileged in a way which Alta and I, as yet, haven't had the opportunity of being. I am sure that as women we are serious-minded and earnest and deeply interested in mankind. By January 1916, she was blunter. As a woman of 43, I should like to have more money to help with. I am worthy of more confidence on your part. He sent her $2,500 a month, then doubled it to $5,000. In the logic of a man who had transferred hundreds of millions in securities to his son over the years, doubling your daughter's monthly stipend is an act of profound restraint disguised as generosity. Bessie was the first to break. By the time she married Charles Strong, her nervous disorders were already present. The Rockefeller family suffered broadly from such conditions. The sustained tension of their public position had physical consequences, and the children absorbed them. Strong was a serious academic, deeply committed to his philosophical work at Columbia University. Their daughter Margaret was born in 1897 at Pocantico Hills. For a few years, the marriage appeared functional. By April 1903, the family was alarmed enough by Bessie's deterioration, nervous disorders, a possible stroke, cognitive decline, that they traveled to Cannes, France, for medical consultation. Charles continued developing the philosophical ideas that would become his 1918 book, The Origin of Consciousness. Bessie deteriorated. She never came home. The Riviera became her permanent residence, beautiful, warm, and utterly removed from the life she'd known. Whether the isolation was voluntary or simply the most comfortable arrangement available, the effect was the same. The eldest Rockefeller daughter spent her final years in a French hotel, her mind and body failing, her daughter still a child, her husband absorbed in his work. On November 12, 1906, she suffered a paralytic stroke. 2 days later, on November 14th, Elizabeth Rockefeller Strong died at the Hotel du Parc in Cannes. She was 40 years old. JDR Sr. mourned privately, extending financial support to Strong and to his 9-year-old granddaughter Margaret. His reserved demeanor and grief matched what Edith would later call outside barriers which you have thrown up to protect yourself. He felt things. He just couldn't let his children in to see it. Bessie died having spent years cut off from everything she'd known. Too sick to engage, too wealthy to be approached without complications, too far away for anyone who genuinely loved her to sustain real contact. The world barely noticed. Alta noticed. She drew the only conclusion that seemed to work. She moved to Mount Hope Farm and contracted her life to fit the conditions the name imposed. Prentice was an attorney with serious lineage. His uncle had been the law partner of Robert Todd Lincoln, and he ran the thousand-acre Williamstown estate with the same systematic precision others brought to investment portfolios. By the 1930s, the farm employed geneticists to develop more productive cattle and poultry strains. It was, in its own way, the most Rockefeller-adjacent activity imaginable, running a system with cold efficiency. Alta had 3 children. She founded settlement houses, supported hospitals and museums, gave steadily and without drama. She lived until June 21, 1962, dying at 91 as the last surviving child of JDR Sr., her estate valued at $12,775,000. Almost exactly what she'd been given. She hadn't gambled, hadn't patronized avant-garde artists, hadn't tried to buy psychological transformation. She had simply disappeared. And that, in its own way, was a tragedy. A life contracted to fit the cage rather than expanded to break it. Then there was Edith. At 23, she married Harold McCormick in November 1895, merging the Standard Oil fortune with the McCormick Reaper dynasty. They moved to 1000 Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, co-founding a resident opera company, establishing an infectious disease institute, providing the land that became Brookfield Zoo. Edith wore a Cartier necklace featuring 10 massive emeralds set among more than 1,600 diamonds, a pearl necklace worth $2 million. She spent freely, furiously, in direct rebellion against the enforced austerity of her childhood. She had children, a son named Jack, born in 1897, a daughter named Editha, born in 1903. Jack died of scarlet fever in 1901, at 4 years old. Editha died in 1904, 2 children, dead before either reached school age. What followed wasn't a dramatic, visible collapse. It was something slower and more complete. The woman who had commanded Chicago's social calendar gradually stopped leaving her house. By 1910, Edith McCormick was functionally imprisoned inside the mansion on Lakeshore Drive, seized by agoraphobia so severe that the outside world had become unreachable. She was 38 years old, one of the richest women in America, and she couldn't walk out her own front door. Harold's cousin, Medill McCormick, introduced Edith to Carl Jung in September 1912. Jung was 37, brilliant, and still building his institutional reach. Edith was 40, had lost 2 children, lost her mobility, lost any recognizable version of herself. Jung met with her daily in New York for weeks before either of them crossed the Atlantic, then continued the sessions on board the ship to Switzerland. In April 1913, Edith arrived in Zurich and moved into a suite at the Hotel Bauer au Lac. She stayed for 8 years. What she found in Zurich wasn't a cure. It was a framework. Jung privately called her brilliant, complicated, and a latent schizophrenic. The analysis was intense. Harold resigned as treasurer of International Harvester in 1914 to remain with her in Switzerland. His presence didn't save the marriage. The analysis deepened. The marriage hollowed out. Edith's money, in Zurich, did something genuinely productive for the first time. In 1916, she funded the founding of the Psychological Club Zurich with a gift of 360,000 Swiss francs, the institutional home of Jungian psychology that still exists. She paid to have Jung's writings translated into English, making his ideas accessible to the Anglophone world at a pivotal moment in the development of modern psychoanalysis. From February 1918 through October 1919, she gave James Joyce a monthly benefaction of 1,000 francs, sustaining him while he worked. She wasn't just spending, she was building. When Freud heard about the psychological club gift, he responded in one sentence, "So Swiss ethics have finally made their sought-after contact with American money." Jung, for his part, described Edith's father in terms that illuminate everything about the daughters. "Rockefeller is really just a mountain of gold, and it has been dearly bought. He also thought JDR Sr. was lonely, obsessed with his own health, and tortured by a bad conscience. The father's psychology was the daughter's inheritance, more than any trust. After extended analysis, Edith became a Jungian analyst herself, building a full-time practice of more than 50 patients. She returned to America in 1921. She and Harold divorced in December of that year. Harold married Polish opera singer Gana Walska the following August. Back in Chicago, Edith rebuilt. She constructed Villa Turicum, a lavish suburban estate in Lake Forest. She established the Chicago Zoological Gardens in 1923 and funded a $17 million trust to erect works by two architects she'd known in Zurich. She moved through the city with the confidence of a woman who had spent 8 years in analysis and emerged with something most people her age had never developed: a genuine, examined interior life. She also, by 1922 and 1923, began telling people she was the reincarnation of Ankhesenpoaten, the wife of Tutankhamun. The Tutankhamun excavations of 1922 gave this claim a cultural moment that amplified it. Edith had been devoted to the occult and astrology for years. This wasn't a sudden eccentricity, but the public expression of a private cosmology. Chicago society, which had adored her, began treating her as something between fascinating and unstable. Then came 1929. The stock market crash found Edith's finances already dangerously extended. Her spending had outpaced her assets. Via Turicum couldn't be maintained. Her debts outran her investments. The fortune that had generated the public hatred she'd grown up beneath, the patriarchal structure that had excluded her, the wealth she'd spent her adult life trying to metabolize, it was gone. Her father didn't rescue her. JDR Sr., who had watched her spend for decades, who had sent her $5,000 a month while she owed hundreds of thousands to creditors, chose not to intervene. By the time of her death, it was her brother John Jr., not her father, who provided an allowance of $1,000 a day and moved her into the Drake Hotel. Edith Rockefeller McCormick died on August 25, 1932, of breast cancer. She was 59. A growth had been removed in 1930. The cancer returned. She died surrounded by family, not alone, as Bessie had been in Cannes, but effectively destitute, sustained by her brother's charity, in a hotel room that wasn't hers. Her estate, when assessed, consisted mostly of real estate from a trust her father had established in 1923, holding almost no Standard Oil stock. She and two of her children, John and Editha, are buried at Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. The daughter of the world's richest man died in debt. JDR Sr. outlived her by 5 years. The cruelty of this story is that it isn't about neglect or indifference in any simple sense. JDR Sr. loved his daughters. Edith's letter to him after her mother's death: "There is warmth and love in your heart when we can get through all the outside barriers which you have thrown up to protect yourself," isn't an accusation from someone who felt unloved. It's something more painful. It's a daughter who can see the love and can't reach it. In that gap, between the love that existed and the connection that never formed, the entire story of the Rockefeller sisters lives. The fortune created the siege conditions that made trust impossible in childhood. The public identity made friendship transactional in adulthood. The patriarchal inheritance structure excluded the daughters from the only arena where they might have found real purpose. And when Edith, the most determined of the three, tried to spend her way to wholeness, the money eventually ran out. Bessie died at 40 in a French hotel. Her mind eroded. Her world contracted to a few rooms on the Riviera. Alta lived to 91 by making herself small enough to fit the space the family name allowed. Edith burned through everything trying to expand beyond those limits and died with her brother paying her hotel bill. 3 daughters, Between them, they received more in trusts and lifetime gifts than most governments spend annually on their citizens. None of them managed to buy the one thing they actually needed: the ability to enter a room without calculating what everyone in it wanted from them. The ability to love without the transaction running in the background. The ability to be a person, not a symbol. The Rockefeller name is still synonymous with American wealth and power. What it cost the women who bore it has never made the headlines. Subscribe for more stories like this.